you have a Bible this morning, we're going to start our reading today in the book of Matthew chapter 8. We may read a few places today. If I had a message title for this, it would be Matthew's Message, You Can Trust Him. Matthew's Message, You Can Trust Him. Now, speaking of Matthew, speaking of Jesus. And as I was reading this week, studying and not really thinking about the sermon, just reading to study. As I was going through the book of Matthew, these words kept reappearing every chapter. Belief, faith, these words that have, in effect, the same meaning. What we would say today is trust. And a number of things were striking me about this week, and we may try to read some of these, but we're going to read a diversity of people and a diversity of situations. Some of them are the people that are the very closest to Jesus that there ever was on earth, and perhaps ever was, period. And some people were not at all close to Him. They were not of the same religion. They were not of the same nationality. They were not conducting themselves in a manner that was acceptable to the ethnic group of the Jews. Some people were unclean. So legally, they were not permitted to be around everybody else, especially, you would think, not God on earth. And one of the many things, and I've mentioned this a lot lately because I suppose I've just appreciated it more than normal. Jesus just welcomed them all to come to Him. When we list off all the virtues of God and all of His qualities and attributes, that's probably not one that gets mentioned, but is one that I am so grateful for. Everybody can come to Jesus. I wish I was that way, but I'm not. There are people who their look, not that I have some overt bias, but maybe they look scary. Maybe they have a stench. Maybe they look some way that my first reaction is to repel. And I suppose uncertainty in human nature and our love of self causes us at times to just insulate ourselves from other people. At times, if someone looks like they're going to be too much work, I kind of insulate myself from them. I wish I wasn't that way, but I am. Jesus wasn't that way. And not only did He have an open door policy, but He had an invitational policy. In other words, it wasn't just you can come, but it's I want you to come. This morning, I want you to know that regardless of what religious people or institutions have failed you, or perhaps I've been reading this book about a Saudi convert that after he was converted and he would go to these churches in the Middle East and he would go to these churches even in America, he had a long peppery beard and he had a look that was uncommon to these people, and so these church people kept pushing him away out of fear. And I was thankful that he did not conflate their attitude with God's attitude. That he kept pursuing worshiping God in a collective group despite the way that people treated him, because as he read God's word, he saw that God welcomed all people. And these people that we're going to read about are a myriad of people from a diversity of backgrounds. And what you'll notice in all of these stories that we read, whether we get to all of them or not is doubtful, but is that what caused them to go to Jesus was all different things. And yet he welcomed them all. The first one that we're reading about here in Matthew chapter 8 is about a Roman centurion. And this people was known to have great conflict with the people that surrounded themselves with Jesus because they were enslaved. The Roman centurions enslaved, or the Roman people enslaved the Jews. They were under their rule. And the centurions were most often the hands and feet which enforced that rule. And so even when Jesus is speaking on the Sermon on the Mount and he begins to talk about the injustice, one of the specific injustices that he is talking about is when a Roman centurion would require a Jew to go with him a mile, Jesus says to him what? Go with them 2 miles. If you're smacked on a cheek, turn the other cheek. And so even Jesus, in other parts of his ministry, accentuates the mistreatment of this centurion group. We read in the book of Luke chapter 7 of this account, and it doesn't tell us this in Matthew chapter 8, but it was not actually this centurion that came to Jesus. This centurion sent a messenger on his behalf, and the reason is because the centurion did not feel worthy to come into the presence of Jesus. And so he sent a man ahead to go ask Jesus for help for someone he cared for. Here's what it says in verse 5. Now recognize this is all taking place, and these messengers were Jewish leaders that were sent. So this is a ploy that everybody does, right? Even as a young child, you find the one in the group that you think when they go to authority, they're most likely to get the yes. Right? In our group, it's Landry, right? They all send Landry to us. I don't know why, but they all send him, and they go ask mom and dad this. And that's sort of what's occurring here, is that they send these Jewish elders to go and to ask Jesus for this healing for a servant of this Roman centurion. Here's what it says in verse 5. And when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion, beseeching him or begging him and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. And Jesus saith unto him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof. But speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this man, go, and he goeth, and to another, come, and he cometh, and to my servant, do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard it, he marveled, and said to them that followed, Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great a faith, no, not in Israel. And I say unto you, that many shall come from the east and west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said unto the centurion, Go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. And his servant was healed in the selfsame hour. We'll read here in just a minute in this very same chapter another occurrence, but this man comes to Jesus, or this man sends servants to Jesus, and has a servant, and it says there that he's grievously tormented. Now, in all these occasions where these people in the book of Matthew, every single one that we're going to read to you today, and every single time where these people are crying out It's because they're within a certain circumstance that is propelling them, a visual, physical circumstance that they can see or they can feel. And as a result of that, it compels them to run to Jesus. Now we know and believe here at this church, and it's exhorted often, that if you're here and you're lost this morning, I want you to recognize that through faith, you can ascertain a certain fact about yourself. And that is, you are in the most dangerous of circumstances that a person could ever be in. I tremble at the thought that we are so dependent and thoughtful about the natural world that we almost live as though the spiritual world does not exist whatsoever. But I want to tell you this morning that the physical realm is very real. If there is such thing as more real, it is more real than this natural realm. In this very hour, there are angels and demons running to and fro upon this earth, carrying out the cause or the will of God or the will of Satan. There are invisible principalities and powers, the Bible tells us in the book of Ephesians, and they're real. And as people in this modern day are so consumed with the natural destructions and wars, and listen, we ought to care about what's going on in the world, and we ought to have sympathy for those who are being abused and attacked and all the unfortunate things that transpire. But listen, our sympathy in those things ought not to exceed our compassion and sympathy and desire for the travesties that are occurring in the spiritual realm. Because the Bible, even Jesus told us that wars and rumors of wars and famines and all of these things are going to happen because they are natural to our fallen world. And as long as the world goes on, 10,000 years from now, if God allows the world to go on, there will continue to be these problems or other worse problems in the world. And very often Christian people can begin to allow their tenderness of heart to cause their eyes and their heart and their minds to become distracted by the noble attempt to alleviate the natural sufferings of mankind. And although we ought to, as we can, as God presents us the opportunity, alleviate those things, it ought never in our hearts and minds to trump the need for our hearts to be focused upon what the world cannot see. We pray, God, help us to see what is naturally blinded to us. If I had to define, in short, a spiritual person, it would be in this: a person who sees the spiritual, not the natural. So when death is diagnosed, their first reaction is not preventing what is inevitable, but it is preparing for what is eternal. In your loved one and in mine, when we request prayer, when we show our concern, where should our concern lie? Where should the heart of our concern lie? Yes, a person's physical body, we may pray for healing there. And yes, we may pray for their morale to be able to endure the suffering that may cause them great stress and anxiety. And yet none of that comes close to the spiritual standing that person has with God. All of these people, this man was calling out to help for one of his servants because his servant was being naturally tormented. Do you know why we worry for these that are lost among us? You see, God and this man believed, and thankfully he did. This man believed, truly believed, that Jesus had the power to, by his own word, alleviate the natural sufferings of his servant. But we all know that there is coming a final hour where all of the miracles that Jesus has done in saving a soul will cease. And there is a prospective torment that is greater than what the mind could ever conceive. God has spoken in his word as clearly about this torment as he has about everything. And for people to casually walk around in this world purposely naive to what might lie ahead in their mind or what is certain to lie ahead in what the Bible has revealed is the most foolish travesty a person could ever make. Avoidance of those thoughts does not take away the reality of what is to come. And so it is incumbent upon those of us who through faith believe the words of Jesus to concern ourselves with the eternal well-being of those that we love and to encourage them, perhaps even to beseech them to take their souls more seriously. Here's a point I want to make this morning. What drove this man and these people in the book of Matthew to Jesus was their conditions. If you're lost this morning and you are not driven to the foot or to the feet of Jesus, I want you to know that your condition has been masked to your heart and mind. I mean, really. If your conditions, your real condition, you were aware of it. And that's something to pray if you're lost this morning. If you have struggled with this apathy towards your soul's condition, if you've struggled not believing and being distracted of all the things in this world, here's what you ought to pray. God, reveal to me what is my soul's condition right now. If you're not feeling the weight of conviction and sin as you ought, God, open my eyes that I might see what is around me. What is my destiny if nothing changes? These people call it, that's what we call, and has been called for quite some time, conviction of sin. And what the religious world seems to be terrified today of is conviction of sin. Everybody seems to be afraid of causing discomfort or causing a disturbance of people's minds, and they're willing to allow people to stroll comfortably into the place of eternal torment, all so that we don't cause discomfort to come upon the minds of those that we love. And yet, in that attempt, we are showing the most unkind, unloving action that we ever could by not speaking to them the hard truth about their soul's condition. Hell is real. And it's gaining people by the day, by the millions and millions and millions of people every day. It's not fun to think about that. It doesn't lift your heart up into heaven, does it? And yet it's necessary. This week we're going into revival. Most of you know that. I pray, as David wrote, the pains of hell get a hold of all of us. Every single person in this room, I hope the pains of hell gets a hold of. If you're saved here this morning, when was the last time you felt the pains of hell? For those that you love. You ever been so disturbed in the mind? I know you have. Have you ever had such a burden of conviction roll upon you that trying to sleep was just a joke? Some of you may honestly say no. I haven't. Well, let me tell you, it exists. You can be saved by God's grace and be found in terror of the pains of hell for those that you love. you can be taken. Why? Because the pains of hell balanced with our love for men. So you have this deep, abiding love for somebody that is deeper than you have a love for yourself. And then you know that based upon their own profession. Now, I want to pause for a minute and say this. I think a lot of people in this world, and I don't think in this room, but I think a lot of people in this world don't have such a deep love. Because this culture is so self-focused. Most people in the world don't have an eternal godly love about them. And so maybe the problem is not the awareness of hell. Maybe the problem is the love for others. That the small bubble that people are choosing to live in and trying to prevent or trying to develop immunity from anything that could cause their own minded disturbance. Listen, me thinking about my children going to hell is a thought I never want to think about. And sometimes I purposely avoid the thought. But love compels me to consider it. I must think about it. Evidently, this man who was sick was not able or willing to make an attempt to get to Jesus himself. And so notice what happens. Somebody did for him. You see that? And doesn't that define the world today? I mean, how few people in your life are eagerly seeking Jesus? Like, list them in your head. Don't just think about it for a minute. How many people in your life that are lost are not just lost, but are lost and are in serious pursuit of God? They may not know that it's through Jesus. They may not know what to do and how to do it. But how many people in your life are known to you that their fixture of their life is that they have got to know God? I don't know that I can think of one actively today in my life that I know of who is actively in pursuit. Maybe one or two, maybe three or four, who their life is bent around the pursuit of knowing or finding out God. Because I'll tell you this, if the Christian message is true and you're convinced of its truthfulness, that there is a God, and that God has created a way for you to know him, and a failure to do so will result in eternal torments. If that is true, should it not compel every breathing creature to take God seriously? This man loves his servant. What a strange thing to say, you know? He loves his servant. Later in Matthew, we were going to read, and we're not going to get there. There was a man who had a daughter, Jairus' daughter. And so he rushes and wants Jesus to come and to heal his daughter. And that's such a natural affection to have. There's another woman later on in that very story that takes place in the middle who she's got an issue of blood she's had for 12 years. And these people are pressing on Jesus. And so she's pushing through for her own healing. Makes sense, doesn't it? When you have an ailment, when you had the prospects of eternal death and eternal torment, it compelled you to act. This man's love for his servant was so great that he had to get to Jesus on his behalf. You know, one of the things that happens when a person is saved, and the evidence that God has saved you, is that you love people. It's an unnatural love. I've said this before. It may sound funny, and that's okay. I've had burdens for celebrities before. Even recently, there was a commentator, and I watched as the gospel was shared with him. This commentator is an Orthodox Jew, and this preacher stood before him and began to explain to him the meaning of Isaiah chapter 53. And for about 12 to 15 minutes, as I was watching this video, my eyes were just filled up with tears. And I was praying, God, please let his heart hear it. Please let his heart hear this message about Jesus, the crushed, the bruised serpent, with the most clear of all the passages in all the Bible, the most clear expressions of the suffering servant, the Messiah that could ever be given. God gave to Isaiah 53, and here this highly intelligent, perceivably sincere man is listening to Isaiah 53, and then he's hearing the message of the gospel about Jesus and about all that Jesus had come to say and do, and how he fulfilled all of that. And my heart was broken. Please, God, speak. Love knows no boundaries, because when the love of God has been placed within us, we love like God does. You don't even, it's not something you even are conscious of or prepared to do. When God's love indwells, you just start loving people. This man was. And because it said in verse 13, this is not the direction I was going to go this morning, but be that as it may. Verse 13, go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. Jesus marvels in verse 10. I've thought about that often. In one place, so in the same chapter, we have Jesus' remarks about people's faith. That's what I was going to talk about this morning. I'm not going to get all these things, but I want to point this out. In verse 10, Jesus looks upon the faith of this centurion, a Roman centurion. Doesn't have all the religious, historical background of understanding the Messiah, doesn't have the oracles of God given to them, doesn't have the promises, doesn't have the awareness of all those things, presumably. And yet his faith is deep and real. Listen, today Americans treat faith just very often terribly. Like faith is this, I cross my fingers and pray into the divine abyss or abyss. That there might be a God. So with all these things happening in the Middle East, maybe if I just cross my fingers and I say these really great words, that some God in the abyss will interact over there. That's not true, genuine faith. Faith has an object. Or in other words, there is something specific or someone specific that you are trusting in. And in all of these occurrences in Matthew, these people are not just going to the apostles. They're not just going to the synagogue. They're not just going to the temple. They're going to one man for help. Jesus. When Jesus hears the story, and it's better told in Luke 7, when Jesus, or more fully told in Luke 7, when it's told, Jesus sees the faith of this man, and he marvels at his faith. He marvels at how much faith that he has. So let's pause for a moment. I feel like the text immediately causes the reader to then reflect on self, right? How does God react to my faith? If Jesus marveled at his faith, where is my faith? Later on, in verses 23 through 27, we see the disciples. If anybody should have faith on earth, would it not be those most closely acquainted with the divinity of Jesus Christ? Or in other words, if you have seen a man acting like what you would think God would that not elicit from you, there is nothing should surprise me about what this man does? And so on one hand, we have the most unlikely source of faith, having a tremendous faith that God marvels at. And on the other hand, we have a bunch of disciples, his closest followers, in a boat, having seen the miracles, many of the miracles of Jesus, having known who he was, having slept around the campfire with him. They know God inwardly and outwardly, and yet they're in a storm, and Jesus is in that storm with them, and they begin to doubt. And they're running around, and they're terrified, and they're afraid. And very often, we as Christian people can become that way when we see a number of things. When we see, of course, physical ailment, we begin to panic and think somehow this has interrupted God's order. And so we've got to plead that God would put things back on the path that we think they should go. But perhaps in a spiritual realm, it is most demonstrated when we begin to see the hard-heartedness of lost people and we kind of abandon our faith that God can do anything to them. And it's as though Jesus, having calmed the storm, looks at us like he did those apostles and says, "Oh, ye little faith, why did you doubt me?" Now, it's interesting, that word little faith. I can't prove this. You can look this up and see if you can't understand it better yourself. The word little faith, in the translation, it's one Greek word. So the way the translators put it is, you of little faith. But I think the way that it was originally understood was like a nickname or a title. And it was one word, and it was little faiths. O ye little faiths. As if that's a title describing or a nickname. And we often do that when somebody has a predominant character quality. We give them a title that reflects that predominant character quality. And so Jesus, and he says it multiple times, and each time that he says it to people that ought to have more faith. They have already witnessed what God has done, and as a result, he expects them to believe. And when they don't, he says to them multiple times, "Oh, you little faiths." And so, begs the question this morning, as we no doubt at this church have great needs, natural needs, mostly great spiritual needs. Sister Lori said this morning about family members who are not here and seem to have no concern about their standing with God. Oh, what a weight, what a burden to carry. And yet, is there a family in this room that is untouched by that? Is there a person in this room that doesn't have likely multiple people in their family that are spiritually unconcerned with where they stand? And so I ask you, are you trying to get to Jesus on their behalf and beseeching God to help? Or are you such a little faith that you've abandoned any attempt to even get to him? Or does God marvel at your faith? I'm going to close by saying this. One thing I love about God's requirements here in faith, it's not contingent on ability or intelligence at all. Like, I say this often, and it sounds funny when I say it out loud, that God is just so amazing. You know, it is hard to conceive of a God that exalted, that requires something so accessible to us. While men set expectations and standards which far exceed the majority population's ability to do, God says, trust me. And he makes it so simple, he even says this, have the faith of a grain of a mustard seed. Or in another place, he takes a child and he says, have the faith of a child. Perhaps if it was some by closeness to God was given by some exalted display of heroism or some extraordinary talent or intelligence, then maybe men would be interested in pursuing it. But God says, trust and believe and pursue my son. God is attentive to those. This morning, if I could orient the message at all, it would be to us that are saved by God's grace, that God would trouble our spirits and prompt us to faith in Him and in Him alone. I'll say this, and I'm done. I pray that God would burden us today. Burden us. A burdening is quite the interruption, as if you have something more important to do. Right? I mean, really. As if we have more important things to do than entertain our concern for the souls of men. Remember, we don't. And if you think you do, I want to remind you of Jesus' words. All these things the Gentiles seek after. And God knows that you have need of those things. Yet, He says to us, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all of these things will be added unto you. You know what I love about God's way? Is that when He sees people set their affection on His things and concern themselves with His concerns, God, knowing what we need, provides for our temporary, what often amount to trivial concerns, and gives us His things, which are greater than what we understood in the first place when we started setting after His things. I read a quote that I'm going to butcher, but it stuck with me all week. I was reading about prayer, and here's what it said. This was in the midst of somebody who is dying. This is what this prayer was. He said, if we knew the things that God knows when He answers our prayers, we would want the answer He gave us all along. In other words, we see just a small amount of things. But if we saw what God sees, we would not only fail to be dissatisfied with what He gave, we would be grateful that He gave us what He did.